There are certain silences that don't belong to nature. Not the silence of snowfall, or the quiet of a church at dawn. This was something else. Something that pressed against the ears, like a held breath. Like the world itself was waiting for someone to notice. On the morning of March 14, 1912, a locomotive belonging to the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad came to a slow, grinding stop on a stretch of high desert track in southeastern Utah, roughly 41 miles from the nearest town. No mechanical failure. No broken rail. No signal wire down. The engine was still running. The coal was still burning. The lights inside the passenger cars were still on. Everything aboard that train was exactly as it should have been. Except the people. 63 ticketed passengers. 4 crew members. A porter named Ellis who'd been riding that line for 11 years. Gone. Every single one of them. Not a struggle. Not a scream frozen in the frost along the windows. Not so much as a hat knocked from a rack or a coffee cup tipped from a tray. The meals in the dining car were still warm. A newspaper was folded open to the 3rd page. A woman's gloves were laid across a seat cushion, one on top of the other, as if she'd simply stepped away to powder her face and forgotten to come back. The conductor's logbook, found on the floor of his compartment, had its last entry made at 4:47 in the morning. It read, in handwriting that pressed harder than usual into the page, "Something is wrong with the dark outside." That was it. That was all he left behind. What happened to those 67 souls has never, officially, been explained. But the truth was buried. Deliberately. And tonight, we're going to dig it up. To understand what was found on that train, you have to understand what kind of country this was in 1912. Not the postcard version. Not the myth they sold at the World's Fair. The real country. The one where men in positions of power had learned to make inconvenient things disappear. Where a sheriff's word was law, a newspaper editor could be bought for the price of a new coat, and a federal investigation could be quietly strangled in its cradle before it ever drew its first breath. The Denver and Rio Grande was not just a railroad. It was a machine of commerce and political leverage that stretched across 4 states and answered to men whose names you'd recognize from the sides of buildings. When word reached the company's offices in Denver that one of their trains had been found driverless and empty in the Utah desert, the first call made was not to the police. It was not to the territorial governor. It was to a man named Harold Cruz. The railroad's private counsel and, according to documents recovered decades later from a federal archive in Provo, a senior associate of a fraternal organization with documented ties to land seizure operations throughout the Four Corners region. The first official responders on the scene were not lawmen. They were company men. Private contractors who arrived on horseback within 6 hours of the discovery, before local authorities even received word that anything had happened. That timing matters. 6 hours, on horseback, across that terrain, in the dark. Someone had to have known before the alarm was raised. Someone had to have already been close. By the time the San Juan County Sheriff arrived the following morning, the train had been swept. Not searched. Swept. The dining car dishes had been removed. The conductor's logbook had been replaced with a clean one. The passenger manifest, the only document that could have told us exactly who was on that train, was missing. Not lost. Missing. There is a difference, and the people who took it knew exactly what it was. There was one person who should not have survived to tell what she knew, and for a long time, the men who wanted this buried believed that she hadn't. Her name was Cecilia Merrow. She was 34 years old, a schoolteacher from Montrose, Colorado, traveling alone to visit her sister in Moab. She was not listed on the recovered manifest fragments because, as we'd later learn, she had purchased her ticket in cash at the platform, a last-minute decision she would spend the rest of her life believing was the reason she was still alive. Cecilia was not on the train when it was found. She had left it. Sometime in the hours before dawn, she had climbed from a rear passenger window, dropped onto the desert floor, and walked, in near total darkness, in March in the high desert cold, nearly 9 miles before collapsing outside a sheep rancher's homestead north of the Lisbon Valley. She arrived barely conscious, her feet bleeding through her boots, her voice reduced to a raw whisper. She told the rancher's wife one sentence before she lost consciousness. The rancher's wife repeated it to her husband. Her husband wrote it down in a letter to his brother in Price, Utah, and that letter passed between family members for 60 years before being donated to a local historical archive in 1974, is where this investigation truly begins. The sentence Cecilia Merrow whispered was this: "They came in through the coupling doors, and they were wearing the uniforms." Whose uniforms? She didn't say, or couldn't. But when investigators working independently in the 1970s tracked down Cecilia's surviving niece, an elderly woman living in Tucson, who had read every word her aunt ever wrote in private journals never intended for public eyes, the picture that emerged was something far more organized, far more deliberate, and far more connected to the machinery of American power than anyone had wanted to believe. Cecilia hadn't fled from a ghost. She'd fled from men. Men who knew exactly which car she was in. The journals of Cecilia Merrow run to nearly 400 handwritten pages, and they were never meant to leave her possession. She wrote in them the way a person writes when they have no one left to tell, compulsively, obsessively, returning again and again to the same night, the same details, as if by repeating them precisely enough she could somehow make the world understand what she had witnessed and what the world had chosen not to hear. She described the hours leading up to what she called the taking with an almost clinical precision. The train had been running normally. Passengers were sleeping, reading, quietly talking in the low-lit cars. Cecilia had been awake. She suffered from insomnia, sitting near the rear of the second passenger car with a book she wasn't really reading. She noticed something wrong at approximately 4:30 in the morning. Not a sound. Not a movement. She described it as a change in the quality of the air inside the car. Like pressure had shifted. Like the temperature dropped 2 degrees in 10 seconds and then held. Then the lights in the car ahead of hers went out. Not flickered. Out. Then the sound of the coupling door opening. Then voices. Low, clipped, businesslike. Not panicked voices. Working voices. The kind of voices men use when they are doing a job they have done before. She pressed herself into the shadow beside the window and looked through the gap in the curtain separating the cars. What she saw, she wrote about only once and then circled the entry in red ink with the notation, "I will not write this again." But she had already written it. And what it described was not supernatural. Not mysterious. It was logistical. It was organized. It involved specific names. 2 of which, when cross-referenced against public land records from the Utah Territory between 1908 and 1914, appear on documentation related to the forced relocation of families from a mineral-rich corridor running directly along the route of that train line. This was not random. These 67 people had been chosen. Someone had made a list, with the audience engagement moment woven in naturally. There is a particular kind of courage required to follow a story like this one all the way to the end. Not the courage of soldiers or explorers. A quieter kind. The courage of someone who has decided they would rather know the unbearable truth than live comfortably inside a beautiful lie. If you're still watching, and most people, by now, aren't, you already understand something that took Cecilia Merrow decades to fully articulate in those journals. That the most dangerous thing a person can do in this country is to be standing in the wrong place when money and power need the road cleared. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If your great-grandmother's name appeared on that manifest? If you found those journals in a shoebox? Would you keep pulling the thread? Most people wouldn't. And the men responsible for what happened on that train in 1912 were counting on exactly that. The land corridor that runs through southeastern Utah, the same corridor that train line was built to service, was quietly acquired between 1911 and 1916 by a shell company whose principal investors included 3 of the 7 board members of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. The acquisition was completed at a cost of almost nothing, because the families who had been homesteading that land, some for nearly 2 decades, had been made to disappear before they could file the final deeds that would have given them legal title. 63 of those families had representatives on that train. We know this now because a paralegal working for a Salt Lake City law firm in 1989 was tasked with liquidating an estate and found, in a locked cedar chest belonging to a deceased attorney who had worked railroad corporate law from 1905 until his retirement in 1931, a single folded document. A typed list of names, 63 of them, each one followed by a seat number. Every seat number matched the car assignments that could be reconstructed from partial ticket stubs in the Denver Station archive. Someone had known which seats they would be sitting in before they ever boarded. The question that every person who has ever looked seriously at this case eventually arrives at is the same question, and it is not where did they go. That question, as painful as it is, has a dark enough answer embedded in the land itself. The remote canyon systems east of the Lisbon Valley are vast, largely unexplored even today, and in 1912 were known primarily to men who worked for the people who owned them. No. The question that stops researchers cold, the one that tends to end the investigation, or the investigator, is simpler and far more chilling than geography. Why weren't they reported missing? 67 people board a train. They have families, employers, neighbors, friends. They were traveling to somewhere, which means someone was expecting them. And yet in the newspaper archives from March and April of 1912 across Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, there are no missing persons notices. No grieving family appeals printed in the classifieds. No church bulletins asking for information. The silence on the receiving end of that journey is as complete as the silence that greeted the empty train. Part of this, the research suggests, comes down to who these people were. Homesteaders, seasonal laborers, land claimants working outside the established networks of credit and commerce. People whose absence could be explained, to those who asked, as a decision to move on, to try somewhere else. People with no lawyers, no bankers, no institutional advocates, who would push when a letter went unanswered. But the deeper answer lives in a series of brief telegrams sent from the Denver Railroad offices in the week following the incident. They were sent to postmasters and county clerks in the towns where the passengers had originated. The content of those telegrams, recovered in fragments, suggests that local officials were told the passengers had voluntarily disembarked at an unscheduled stop and were not to be treated as missing persons. Someone had prepared for the questions before anyone even thought to ask them. The closing. Cecilia Merrow lived until 1951. She never returned to Colorado. She never spoke publicly about what she had seen, not once, in nearly 4 decades of silence. But she wrote, relentlessly. She wrote because she understood something that we are only now, a century later, beginning to fully reckon with, that the most effective way to erase a crime is not to destroy the evidence. It is to destroy the people who would have been believed. She was not believed. She tried twice, once in 1913 through a lawyer in Moab who dropped her case after his office was broken into, and once in 1921 through a territorial court clerk who told her, gently but plainly, that what she was alleging would require her to name men whose names could not be named. She burned the drafts of both filings herself. She kept only the journals. She gave them, at the end of her life, to her niece with one instruction: keep these until the men in them are dead. Then let someone read. Those men have been dead for a long time now. What happened on the Utah desert in the early hours of March 14, 1912 was not a mystery in the way we use that word, implying something unknowable, something beyond the reach of human explanation. It was a transaction. 67 people stood between powerful men and something those men wanted, and powerful men in this country have always found a way to handle that particular problem. The desert is wide. The canyons are deep. And in 1912, there was no one watching. There is a cairn of stones in the Lisbon Valley that appears on no official map and corresponds to no documented burial. It has been there, by photographic record, since at least 1934. Local ranchers know it. They don't talk about it. They just walk around it. Some silences are not born from ignorance. Some silences are tended, kept alive on purpose, passed down like an inheritance no one wanted and no one could bring themselves to spend. You weren't supposed to find this. But now you have. And you already know, some part of you already knew, that finding it changes something. Not in the history books. In you. That's how they always counted on it working. And for 113 years, they were right.